Hey everybody, I'm back to tell you about the presidential election of 1808. You may have noticed I tried to do this earlier and for some reason the sound wasn't working, so I had to delete that video and start over. But I hope some of you are finding these deep dives into the presidential elections interesting because I find them really interesting. They're quite different from presidential elections these days, like of the 20th and 21st centuries. But a lot of unusual things, I guess, happen in every presidential election. And it's really rare that somebody goes into a presidential election year as a clear favorite and ends up winning with no sort of drama or unusual things taking place. And sometimes those things are things that sort of interesting points that you can point out to people, sort of factoids that might normally be look irrelevant, but they're kind of interesting at the same time. Anyway, the election of 1808 is one of those. It's one that's often portrayed as being an example of the Federalists in disarray and getting ready to fizzle out as a party, which is kind of an irony because the Federalists were actually on the upswing that particular year. This was the sixth presidential election, and it's the first one in which more than two people were running for president officially, because up until 1800, people running for vice president were sort of also running for president. And some irony is attached to this particular race because George Clinton at the same time was running for president and vice president, which is kind of rare. That did happen one time later with a minor party candidate. And another thing too is 1808 is the year that the idea of the Virginia dynasty was introduced into American politics, which is this idea that the presidents need to be plantation owners from Virginia. And other states started to complain that it was their turn to have somebody serving as president. I would like to mention too that I've had two new subscribers since last time, Dodge Landisman and Jason Savage. So welcome to both of you. I'm very glad to have you. Okay, so let's hop into this. The election of 1808. I'm going to switch this emphasis here. Okay, so let's first talk about what happened in Thomas Jefferson's second term. A lot of the important details of what happened during these 4 years relate to foreign affairs rather than domestic. And a lot of this has to do, not all, but a lot of it has to do with the Napoleonic Wars that were taking place in Europe. After Aaron Burr left office as vice president, though, he moved down to the southwestern part of the United States and tried to start a country of his own down there. And that's called the Burr Conspiracy, and it failed, and he was captured and brought back and put on trial for treason. Henry Clay was part of his defense team. Just one of those weird things that happens sometimes in American history when a defeated politician tries to figure out what he is supposed to do now. So that occupied a lot of Jefferson's second term. The Napoleonic Wars were very difficult for the United States. Jefferson sort of supported France in all of this, and both England and France were attacking U.S. shipping. And I have a slide coming up where I'll delve into that just a little bit more into detail. But one of the results of this, both sides, England and France, attacking U.S. shipping, was Jefferson got Congress to pass the Non-Importation Act of 1806. And this was a bill, an act, which restricted U.S. commerce only with England, not with France. So the U.S. was weighing in on the complications of the Napoleonic Wars. As far as domestic policy, just a few interesting things. The midterm election of 1806 to 1807 essentially resulted in the same makeup of Congress as it had been. So that was not a repudiation of Jefferson's administration, which is a little bit unusual because usually that happens in the second term, but not this time. However, the Democratic-Republican Party, being sort of generally the dominant party, started to break into factions. One group of people in Congress was upset by the fact that Jefferson was not doing everything that he said he was going to do when he ran for president. The United States still had an army. The United States still had a navy. James Madison, who was the Secretary of State, was supposed to get rid of a lot of his employees in the Department of State. And the people that he kept, who worked both for him and in foreign embassies, tended to be Federalists. But the reason that he kept them was that the United States had a really complicated system of encryption for secret messages, and it was only a group of Federalists who knew how to do that. It was a complicated two-step process we don't necessarily need to go into here. But the issue is that Jefferson wanted to dramatically reduce the federal payroll, and Madison was keeping not only 6 clerks, which is not a lot of people, but they were Federalists, which is an issue too. Another interesting thing that most people don't about is the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were sent to explore the territory that the United States had purchased from Napoleon, the Louisiana Territory. This is a map that just shows where they traveled up the Missouri River and eventually made their way to the Pacific Ocean and then returned. And they brought back all kinds of interesting things with them. So this was like a highlight of Jefferson's second administration that is often celebrated in history books and needs to be mentioned here. Something that's kind of strange about that is that Meriwether Lewis died under really mysterious circumstances not long after that. But William Clark served as a politician in Missouri for a number of years afterwards. Now, I wanted to mention this one incident where a British warship, the Leopard, attacked a United States ship called the Chesapeake in 1807, and this was just right off the coast of Virginia. What the British were doing here is they would sometimes attack U.S. ships, and if they found people who were British citizens before American independence, who worked on ships, they would kidnap these people to work in the Royal Navy. And the process of doing that is something that was called at the time impressment. This was something that the United States did not like, but which happened from time to time. And Thomas Jefferson was very upset about England doing this, obviously. And one of the things that he did was he stopped the process of scaling back the U.S. Navy after this, which ended up being a good thing because that meant the United States had at least a bare navy, given that from our perspective, we know that the War of 1812 is on its way, although Jefferson didn't know that, obviously, at the time. So this was a major incident, and Jefferson, of course, went back to Congress and got them to pass the Embargo Act. So the Embargo Act ended United States trade with other countries. Initially, this was really popular throughout the United States, that we were really standing up to both England and France and just letting them know that we weren't going to let them treat our merchant marine like they were. The problem with it is that a lot of people in the United States depended upon exports for their livelihood, especially farmers who shipped grain or other goods across the Atlantic, people who shipped trees. They would cut the branches off trees and send sort of those posts, the trunk, across the Atlantic, because in England, most of the trees that weren't royally owned had already been cut down at that point. So they were importing trees from North America. Well, that came to an end too. So a lot of people were bearing the brunt of this policy of the Jefferson administration, and the embargo became extremely unpopular. One of the things that's kind of interesting here, the embargo is supposed to be represented by this turtle that's biting the guy who wants to take the barrel to ship whatever is in it over to England, and see what he says, this cursed, "Oh, grab me." Well, the word "oh, grab me," which is really not a word, is the word embargo spelled backwards. So that is sort of the big thing that leads into the election year of 1808, is the embargo. At the beginning of the year, the DRP was encountering some discussions about what should be done. People in Congress who were like the more extreme members of the DRP were led by John Randolph, and those people were called the Quids. And the Quids wanted to have the type of government that Jefferson had promised in 1800 and never really delivered. These were people who generally supported France, and their guy in the administration was James Monroe, who is on the bottom here at the right. James Monroe was in England, and in 1807 and 1808, he worked out a treaty with England to, create a way forward. And so that treaty was sent back over here, and James Madison, the Secretary of State, who's on the left, sat down with President Jefferson. They looked at this proposed treaty, and they realized that the whole issue of impressment was not even covered. So they decided, we're not even going to present this to Congress. Now, Jefferson remained in correspondence with Monroe in England, and he told him at one point that the Quids were trying to get him to run for president, and told him that he should be careful because Randolph was not his friend. Anyway, the Quids decided they were going to support Monroe. Now, in Pennsylvania, the DRP had suffered a division, and the new group was called the Constitutionalist Party. And the Constitutionalist Party, for some reason, was inclined to support George Clinton, who was the vice president and wanted to be president. Jefferson had said that he was not going to run for a third term, which is important because George Washington had established the precedent, but it's really only a tradition after it's done the second time. So Jefferson was the second president to not run for a third term. A newspaper in Washington City, the day after New Year's Day of 1808, had a short article where it's discussing people running for president, and mentioned that 3 names were being presented at that point, which were Madison, Clinton, and Monroe. Now, one thing it should be said about George Clinton real quickly is that up until this point, the new president at the time a vacancy occurred had been the vice president. So Adams had been vice president for George Washington. Thomas Jefferson had been vice president for Adams. So therefore, Clinton thought it was his turn. But as you know in life, not everybody gets a turn. Jefferson generally was in support of James Madison, although he really did like Monroe also, who had returned from England and was in back home in Virginia. One thing that's sort of unusual that hasn't gotten as much attention as it should have is that James Madison and James Monroe had a really rocky relationship. They ran against each other in 1789 for the U.S. House in the first election for under the Constitution, which Madison won. And so then Monroe was elected governor of Virginia, and the two of them didn't agree after Jefferson became president about how to handle some issues in foreign policy. And after the issue of Monroe's proposed treaty had gotten resolved in the sense that it was not going to be presented, his supporters started to have documents published in newspapers to explain his position. And then Madison's supporters presented other documents, sort of the counter argument against what Monroe was doing. Anyway, this is what was happening before the Congressional Caucus. And no mention was even being made about the Federalists taking sides. So generally speaking, in the North, Federalists, for whatever reason, were supporting George Clinton. And in the South, particularly in Virginia, the Federalists were supporting James Monroe. Now, this is strange because George Clinton's positions were, although he opposed the embargo, he was not really aligned with Federalists. Of these three people, James Madison was the most aligned with the Federalists. He was the most moderate of these three potential replacements for President Jefferson. The guy who had presided over the DRP caucus in 1804 came to Congress one day when they were in session, and he handed out little printed slips of paper telling them that he was calling the next caucus into session for them to nominate a candidate. And the supporters of Madison and Monroe in particular wanted to sort of duke it out in the Virginia legislature at the state caucus first, which they did. And they ended up having a double nomination so that one group, the larger of the two groups, unanimously supported Madison. Some Madison supporters went to the Monroe caucus and voted against him, but they wanted to know what was happening that they could report back. Interestingly enough, some Clinton supporters in Congress took that original notice that Stephen Bradley had handed out and went to a printer and got sort of a counter notice put together with almost exactly the same text, except telling people not to attend. Anyway, the events in Virginia happened 2 days before the National Caucus took place. And I'm not really sure why. Everybody says that news of what happened in Virginia didn't arrive in time, so that when the caucus met, they didn't know what had happened in Richmond, which could be true, but the distance from Richmond to Washington City was not that great. So one might think that it's possible that they would have known because it was 2 days, but maybe news just didn't travel that quickly. Anyway, The caucus met in the evening, 6:30, in the U.S. Senate chamber. The Madison supporters had intended they wanted to support him for president and Henry Dearborn, the Secretary of War, for vice president. But they immediately noticed that they faced a problem, which was only one person showed up from New York State. And the whole thing with New York, obviously, they were Clinton supporters. It's sort of a big question why they thought New York was so important. New York was the fourth biggest state. The DRP could easily carry the election without winning New York. For whatever reason, though, they did want to work with people from New York to try to avoid a Clinton candidacy. When they took the ballot, Madison was nominated, and these are the results here. So you can see that Clinton supporters mainly just boycotted it, and Monroe's supporters generally just boycotted it. They also held a vice presidential ballot, and here is where sort of the complications start. What are we going to... The Madison people were trying to figure out, what do we do? Because they already knew that Clinton was angling to run with Federalist support. Although it was kind of complicated because Clinton had been in the executive branch in New York State as governor. He didn't have a lot of experience working in the legislature, and particularly parliamentary procedure was a problem with him. And senators were just unhappy with the way that he presided over the Senate, because he would sometimes call things either the wrong way or out of order, and the parliamentarian would have to overrule him and get things back on track. Now, it was after the election of 1808 that he just really gave up on everything, and he would sit up in the chair and snore, which the senators really hated. But that is after, not at this point. Okay, so what do we do for vice president? What are we going to do about this? And so Madison supporters decided to change strategy, because they decided it would be better to keep him as vice president than to have him run off with the Federalists. So he was renominated for vice president. Some members of Congress, though, just absolutely refused to vote for him because they were so mad at him. And of those, the majority voted for John Langdon. This becomes sort of an issue because since Clinton continued to run for president, while at the same time running for vice president, Madisonians in some states decided that they were going to support Langdon as the vice presidential nominee. And so he will end up in this race receiving electoral votes for vice president. And 3 people decide to stick with Henry Dearborn. Okay, so now we have the tickets, the DRP ticket. One thing I should have mentioned that I didn't is that whereas earlier in 1804, they had called out people's names, asked them who they wanted to vote for, this time in 1808, it was a secret ballot so that nobody knew who was voting against George Clinton, which is the only reason to have a secret ballot. Okay, now we have the campaign of 1808 is beginning, and so the 2 people who lost the nomination at the caucus ran anyway. So in the spring and summer of 1808, 3 candidates were in the field, which are the ones here: Madison, George Clinton, and James Monroe. It was during this time that this newspaper war happened between Madison and Monroe's supporters about the the treaty that he had worked with. In the spring of 1808, the division in the DRP resulted in a major Federalist win in New York State in their elections in the spring. Now, this was because it was a three-way race, and the Federalists got more members of the state legislature than either of the other two DRP factions, which would be the Clintonians and the Madisonians. So after this, the Madison supporters were looking at that, and it's like, okay, well, in New York State, if Clinton's supporters and the Federalists vote together, that entire set of electoral votes from New York is going to be pulled away. And they were starting to get worried about this. So they threatened Clinton that he needed to stop trying to run for president if he was going to continue to be their vice presidential nominee. In New York State, Madison's supporters got together and they said that they were going to support Langdon for vice president. Some other states are going to do that too later. But then something really important happened that kind of changed the trajectory of the election of 1808. And that was that the Madison supporters in Pennsylvania worked out a deal with the Constitutionalists to bring them back into the Democratic-Republican Party. What that means is George Clinton's supporters in Pennsylvania have evaporated. That makes it more likely that James Madison is going to win this election. But the Federalists were looking at all of this, and there was some question, well, what are we going to do? So a group of Federalists called party leaders to meet and hold a caucus in New York City. Now, some Federalists continued to support George Clinton, and so it was unsure beforehand what was going to come of this, but they wanted to figure out a strategy of what they were going to do. In the meantime, though, elections were held in two states of importance. One was Massachusetts, where the Federalists gained a lot of seats in the state legislature, and also North Carolina, where they won an unexpected, they performed much better than expected. In fact, one politician in North Carolina who would sometimes run as a Democratic Republican, sometimes as a Federalist, ran on a party just called the Anti-Embargo Party, sort of as an independent, really an independent Federalist, right? Because he's running against the Jefferson and Madison position about the embargo, but he was elected. Then the date came for this caucus to take place in New York City. And we don't know exactly what date that happened. But they were kind of emboldened because, okay, the Federalists did really well in New York, Massachusetts, North Carolina. Why don't we just run our own ticket? Because Democratic Republicans are divided. Maybe we could win this. I mean, from our perspective today, we can see that we know it's going to be futile for them to try this. But why not? So they decided to run their ticket from 4 years ago. And this ticket, because, sometimes people will say stuff like, well, they knew they were going to lose, so let's just run the same guys. That's really unfair. This was a strong ticket. If Pinckney and King had been elected, the United States would have had a much stronger military and would have been much, much better prepared if the War of 1812 was actually going to happen. So the United States would have been fine if Pinckney had been elected president. He was highly regarded. It's just that some people in certain parts of the country, refused to vote for a Federalist. Okay, so now we have this interesting situation of having 4 people running for president. So let's look at how the election was happening. This is sort of a strategy map. So James Madison was clearly going to win the 5 states in brown. That was good for 49 electoral votes. Pinckney was clearly going to win the 3 states in blue, which is good for 31 electoral votes. And 89 is the majority, but 96 electoral votes were up for grabs. Now, this map shows a little P for the states where Pinckney was contesting the race. And he was contesting all of these, the states, the swing states. George Clinton, by the late summer, was only trying to win in New York. And Monroe was only trying in Ohio, Virginia, and North Carolina. So it's pretty clear that Monroe is not going to be able to win. He might be able to pull enough electoral votes if Clinton could get the vote of New York, or if New York went Federalist. Maybe Monroe could win enough to stop Madison from getting a majority and would go to Congress. But see, the DRP controlled a majority of the state delegations. So they would have, even if Madison did not win a majority in a case like that, he was going to get elected. They had to knock him out in order to stop him from becoming president. So Election Day was held, as it was up until 1844, on a number of window, with the first 4 states voted November 4th, and then the last state was North Carolina on November 11, although 2 states I haven't been able to find when they actually voted. And if you remember from earlier maps, the green states vote statewide. The blue states were broken up into districts, and so voters would go and they would see one person from each party would be running for presidential elector. Then the red states were elected by the legislature. The numbers that show up here represent James Madison's percentage of the vote. Although I see with Ohio, it has 88 is not the right number, because 22, 32, that should be 68% for Madison in Ohio. Anyway, this shows that Madison did really well. He only got 53% in North Carolina, but he got 63% in Maryland. So he clearly got the most votes on that day. He got 65% of the popular vote. And that translated into 87 presidential electors. Pinckney won 16, and Monroe didn't win any presidential electors, which meant he was out, because in no state where electors were chosen by the legislature did he have really the strength to contest. Now, while all this was happening, the U.S. House races were taking place. And the states in green chose members of the U.S. House in the year 1808 for the term 1809 to 1811. And the Federalists gained nationwide. They gained a total of 26 seats, which more than doubled their representation in the U.S. House. And then the states who voted in 1809 for the term 1809 to 1811 gave the Federalists an additional 4 seats in Virginia. So the new U.S. House was 84 Democratic Republicans and 55 Federalists. And again, this goes against that idea of the Federalists just gradually fizzling out as a party, because this was a big boost to their party right in the middle of this supposed Madison runaway election. So now let's just go real quickly into something about the electoral vote, because what happened in New York State was the Federalists decided that they were not going to support George Clinton, and they wanted to just have a three-way race. Clinton's supporters worked out with the Madisonians this deal where they would they would divide the presidential electors, with Madison getting 1/3 in Virginia and Clinton 2/3 of the presidential electors. However, Madison supporters from around the country were just furious about this. And so they wrote in and lobbied the presidential electors who had been chosen by the legislature to drop their support of Clinton and vote for Madison for president. And only 6 of them stuck with their original pledge and voted for Clinton. And the Clintonian newspapers were really upset about this. And so they ran little notices with the names of the people who were faithful to George Clinton and the names of the people who were supposed to vote for him, but changed and voted for Madison instead. So what we see here, first of all, is the Federalists gained. Okay, so they didn't do super well. They still lost. But Pinckney picked up a lot of electoral votes. Because remember, he only got 14 the last time, so he's up to 47. So that is a pretty major increase. And particularly in a state like North Carolina, where it's sort of unusual to think of Federalists doing well in North Carolina, but he got 3 electoral votes there. Anyway, James Madison did win. And because of the complex situation about the vice presidential race, I do have a separate map for that. Because again, a lot of people in the DRP had refused to vote to support Clinton for vice president because he wouldn't back down in his presidential run. So the party in Ohio supported John Langdon. His presidential electors pledged to Madison, and Langdon won in Ohio. In Vermont, where the legislature was evenly divided, the only way that they could resolve it was to choose presidential electors that were pledged to Madison and Langdon again. Enough people were willing to go for that, but they wouldn't go for Madison and Clinton. So John Langdon ended up with 9 electoral votes for vice president. The Clinton electors in New York State divided their vote 50-50 between Madison and Monroe, which is how each one of them ended up with 3 votes for vice president, which seems, it's really strange because they weren't even candidates for vice president. But George Clinton was elected to a second term, interestingly enough, a second term, but with a different president. That only happened one other time in American history. Okay. Clinton was very unhappy about this, being elected to a second term as vice president when he was supposed to be the next president. So, when it came to time for the joint session of Congress to meet, he left and went home. So the president pro tem of the Senate, John Millage, presided over the joint session to count the electoral votes. They had the normal thing with the tellers, and Millage declared the winners. Madison and Clinton. So when Inauguration Day arrived, they had a problem. And that problem was that George Clinton was not there to take the oath. So I'll get in a minute to how that was resolved. This was the first time that people traveled to Washington, D.C. for a presidential inauguration, just to be there, like, this is something great that's happening in our republic, and we can be there, just like people would go to, like people from the general public would travel there to witness the inauguration. So all of the hotels were just packed full, which is it was a great thing for America that people were interested in doing this. Supposedly 10,000 people came to witness the inauguration. So it was held in the House chamber. The President Pro Tem, John Millage, was seated in the chair, and Jefferson and Madison arrived at noon. And at this time, it was common for the incoming president to give the inaugural address before the oath, which is what happened. John Marshall, who was Chief Justice, administered the oath to James Madison. Then that evening, they held the first inaugural ball in American history. Now, George Clinton was in New York State. He was not there to take the oath. Madison called Congress into session early to get started with some things he wanted to do in his administration. And Clinton showed up for that. He presided over the Senate. But the minutes of the Senate never mention that he took the oath. They do mention when incoming senators took their oaths of office. But apparently George Clinton just didn't, and his oath from 1805 was good for his entire 2 terms as vice president. That is, as far as I know, the only time somebody got away with that. John Adams, he was inaugurated late in 1793, if you remember that kind of strange incident. For some reason, Adams decided to go home and miss Washington's second inauguration, which is why he was not there that day. But this thing about George Clinton being unhappy, and so he skips the inauguration, this was the pattern at that time, unlike today where people are expected to be there. Even if they were defeated, they're expected to attend the inauguration of the incoming team. But it was not the pattern back then. So here we have our new team, President James Madison and Vice President George Clinton. This was a very bad pairing of people. They didn't get along, and Clinton ended up dying before the term was out, which was something that the Madisonians probably weren't overly unhappy about, because that meant that they were able to pick somebody else to serve as vice president during Madison's second term. But here is our new team. So the next time we'll get to find out what happened during Madison's first term as president. So I hope that you're finding these sort of deep dives into these presidential elections interesting. And if you do, I do ask you to leave me a comment or subscribe if you haven't. And otherwise, thanks so much, and I'll see you the next time.